If we were to take a magnifying glass to the timeline of human history, scanning through centuries of conflict, conquest, and bloodshed, a disturbing pattern would begin to emerge. While history books often paint wars in the broad strokes of ideology, religion, or national pride, telling us stories of liberty versus tyranny, there is almost always a quieter, colder, and more calculated undercurrent flowing beneath the surface. It is the current of money. It is a rare thing indeed to find a war fought strictly for moral principles, completely detached from the ledger of financial gain. When we peel back the layers of rhetoric and patriotic fervor, we find that the drums of war often beat in time with the accumulation of capital. The blueprint for modern economic warfare was drafted, signed, and executed a little over a century ago during the catastrophe we know as the First World War. Consider for a moment the sheer scale of the Great War. It was a conflict ignited by European empires that eventually drew in the United States, leaving a continent in ruins and claiming the lives of millions. Yet, when the smoke cleared, there was one specific group that emerged not just unscathed, but infinitely more powerful than before. The true victors of the First World War were not the Allied governments, and certainly not the people of Europe or America. The true victors were the banks. This assertion is not mere cynicism, it is a matter of historical record. In 1934, during the depths of the Great Depression, the American public began asking difficult questions about why they had entered the conflict. In response, the United States Senate formed the Nye Committee to investigate the financial interests behind the war. For 2 years, this committee uncovered a labyrinth of secrets, evidence of arms deals, pressure campaigns, and massive profits that linked the decision to go to war directly to the balance sheets of Wall Street. However, just as the committee was closing in on the most damning connections, the investigation was abruptly shut down, its funding cut, and the full extent of the findings was effectively buried. To understand how a consortium of banks effectively captured the American economy and leveraged that control to push a reluctant nation into a global war, we must re-examine the core thesis of this era. While the assassination of Archduke Franz Ferdinand was the spark, a spark cannot cause an explosion unless the powder has been carefully piled up for years. Wars of this magnitude are industrial projects that require years of financial groundwork. Before a single shot was fired, the primary beneficiaries had already been identified, a small, tight-knit circle of international bankers centered around J.P. Morgan and his associates in New York and London. When the war erupted in 1914, the United States officially declared neutrality. For nearly 3 years, America sat on the sidelines while President Woodrow Wilson insisted the U.S. would not get involved. However, while the American military stayed home, American money did not. During those early years, the Allied powers, Britain and France, were desperate for supplies, food, and ammunition. They turned to the United States to buy them, but they didn't have the cash, so they borrowed massive sums from American banks. As the war dragged on, the bankers in New York began to panic. They realized that if the Allies lost, the loans would never be repaid. The American financial system, heavily leveraged on an Allied victory, faced a catastrophic default. To save their investments, the bankers needed the United States military to ensure that Britain and France did not lose. How does a country actually pay for a war? It is not as simple as writing a check. First, domestic spending is slashed and diverted to the military. Then, taxes are raised. When taxes hit their limit, the government prints money, triggering inflation, effectively a hidden tax. Next, they turn to domestic borrowing through war bonds. But in a war the size of WWI, even this is insufficient. The final step is to drain national gold reserves. When the gold is gone, a nation must turn to foreign bankers. This is the moment where national sovereignty dissolves and financial control takes over. This is where J.B. Morgan entered the stage. In the early 20th century, the House of Morgan was essentially a sovereign power. When the war began, the British government designated the bank as the sole purchasing agent for the Allies in the United States. This was an unprecedented monopoly. If the Allies needed wheat, copper, steel, or horses, J.P. Morgan placed the order. Morgan earned a commission on every single item, but the real money was in the financing. Morgan organized a syndicate of American banks to lend money to the British. That money usually never left the United States. Instead, it was deposited into British accounts at Morgan's banks in New York and used to pay American manufacturers, many of whom were also clients or partially owned by the Morgan Empire. This created a perfect circular loan system. The goods were shipped to Europe to be destroyed, while the money stayed in America, enriching the corporate elite. By late 1916, this economic dependency had created a dangerous trap. Britain and France were running out of collateral. If they could no longer borrow, they could no longer buy, and the American export economy would crash. The bankers needed to shift the burden of financing the war from private banks to the American taxpayer. The only way to unlock the U.S. Treasury was for the United States to officially become a combatant.
The obstacle was the American people, who were stubbornly against the war. To bridge the gap, the government launched an aggressive propaganda campaign led by the Nye Committee. The media was mobilized to demonize the enemy, portraying Germans as Huns and human monsters. This was the industrialization of opinion. In a matter of months, the psychological landscape of the country was terraformed. The pacifist sentiment was replaced by a fervent crusading spirit. Once the U.S. entered the war, the floodgates of finance opened. The government authorized Liberty loans, raising billions from the public. Much of this was lent to the Allies, who used it to pay off their debts to J.P. Morgan. The private debts of the banks were successfully converted into the public debt of the American people. The war was a tragedy for humanity, but it was a triumph for finance. The United States transformed from a debtor nation into the world's primary creditor, and the financial capital of the world shifted from London to New York. However, the financial extraction didn't end with the armistice. The Treaty of Versailles imposed reparations on Germany that were designed to extract whatever value remained to pay back the Allies, so the Allies could pay back the American banks. This crushing debt led to the hyperinflation and desperation that allowed the rise of Adolf Hitler. Ultimately, the story of the First World War taught a dangerous lesson. War is the most profitable business on earth, provided you are on the side that is lending the money, not the side that is doing the dying. The financial arrangements of 1917 did not buy peace, they merely purchased a 20-year installment plan on the Second World War. As we look back, we must ask, would the United States have ever entered the trenches if the banks had not been at risk of losing their loans? The history suggests that the march to war was dictated not by the needs of the people, but by the requirements of the ledger.